Well, we are going to be in chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews today and continue our study in that chapter. Believe it or not, this is our 30th week in Hebrews. It seems like we just started this book of the Bible to me, but we started it the first week of April, and this is our 30th sermon, and now here we are knocking at the door of Thanksgiving. But this chapter is such an important chapter in the book of Hebrews. It's all about faith, and we learn about how God is pleased with us through faith. We are seen as righteous to Him by faith, not by works of the law. And so our faith is not rooted in the things that we do. It's not rooted in who we are and the hope of what we can be today. Our faith is rooted in who God is, what He has done, what He is doing, and what He will do. It's rooted in the unseen, is what we're learning in this chapter. And so if we don't study our Bibles, we're never going to come to that conclusion when it comes to our faith. We're never going to have any assurance if we root our hope, if we build our faith and root it in who we are and what we do. We know that we are sinful and we are inconsistent, and if we warp our faith into a man-centered version of faith, we'll end up being so constantly defeated. We'll be hopeless. It's exhausting, and we feel that exhaustion as we wander into that version of Christianity, right? And so that's why we need our Bibles to bring us back to the truth that is our salvation through faith alone. The Bible corrects how we think. It rebukes any sort of man-centered version of faith. And not to mention, if we have a man-centered, works-based version of faith, then our faith is virtually indistinguishable from any other religion in the world. But we have lasting assurance because our hope is rooted in who God is. We have unwavering hope because it's about what He does, who He is. Remember this definition of faith that we started with in this chapter. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. And so just like today, we are prone to warp our faith in God into a man-centered, works-based faith, just like we're prone to do that today. People did that back in Jesus' day. And so the version of Judaism that was happening in the time of Christ was this works-based way of thinking. They wrongfully hyper-focused on works instead of faith in God for salvation. And so whenever these Jews converted to Christianity, they brought that works-based way of thinking into Christianity with them. And so what the author of Hebrews now is doing to correct their works-based thinking, to correct this understanding, the wrong understanding of what faith is supposed to be, he uses Old Testament examples of salvation by faith. And so he's been walking through these people of the Old Testament saying, this person walked by faith, this person walked by faith, this is why God was pleased with them. It's always been about faith. It's always been faith that has pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please Him. Remember that verse in verse 6 there that we learned in this chapter. And so we've talked about Abel, we've talked about Enoch, we talked about Noah, we've talked about Abraham and how he lives by faith. And we remember, if you remember reading in the book of Romans, the author there, Paul, he references Abraham and to prove the same point. If you look at Romans chapter 4, I think I have this marked here. I'll just read to you the first 3 verses of Romans chapter 4 where Paul also uses Abraham as an example of how it's always been about faith and not works. He says, "What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness." And so there, Paul does the same thing that's happening in Hebrews. He's bringing up this Old Testament example to prove to the readers it's always been all about faith. We are saved by faith alone in the works of God, not in our works. And so now, today's example, he moves from Abraham to Moses. If you're going to prove that we're not saved by works, it would be great to go to Moses, right? He's the one that wrote down the law that every Jew was trying to follow to a T. I mean, God gave Moses the law, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible there, and he lived it out, he enforced it. But why was God pleased with Moses? It wasn't for how he followed the law. God was pleased with Moses because of faith. Just like Abel, just like Enoch, just like Noah, just like Abraham, Moses too lived by faith. And Moses is one of the most well-known people in the entire Bible. Last week, I talked about how I likened Abraham to like Hank Aaron is to baseball, like Abraham is to our faith, right? Everybody, if you know anything about our faith, you know all about Abraham. Well, like Moses would be Babe Ruth in that case, right? Everybody knows Moses. And so the story of Moses, when we read it in the Old Testament, the story of Moses starts with his parents. And so I want to challenge you today to, when we're talking about Moses, to think about how many parallels there are to the life of Moses and the life of Christ. Because when we read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see, especially like in Luke, we get the story of Jesus starts with this the faith of his parents, Mary and Joseph. Well, when you look back in the Old Testament to the story of Moses, his story starts with the faith of his parents as well. And so we get like this miniature lesson over faith and parenting and things too. But let's jump in here. Let's pick up in chapter 11 of Hebrews. Before I get ahead of myself, let's pick up where we left off in verse 23 of chapter 11. This is by faith about Moses. Here in verse 23 it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So again, when you go back, we remember the story of Moses. I'm trying to summarize a lot of Moses because we get this little snippet, this little reference, but we know there are chapters and chapters and chapters about Moses in the Old Testament. But if you remember the story of Moses, when he was born a slave. The Egyptians were the most powerful nation, the most powerful civilization on the planet Earth. The Pharaoh, he was the most powerful man on the planet during that time. And when Moses was born, there were too many Jews, and it was making Pharaoh uncomfortable. And so Pharaoh decides to thin them out a little bit. Pharaoh decides during that day, we're going to kill every male Hebrew when they're born. We can let the girls live, or we're going to kill all the males. And he had to enforce this in a couple of different ways because people all weren't on board with that one. That's a pretty big mandate, right? But we look back there that in Exodus chapter 1, this is how Moses' life gets going. Here's the edict here. It says, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. But when Moses was born, fortunately, he was a beautiful child. Did you see that reference there in Hebrews 23? It said Moses was a beautiful child. If you look back in Exodus, it says he was a fine child. So did Moses, we know that his parents put him in an ark and saved him, right? Was it because he was just a really beautiful baby? Like thankfully he wasn't an ugly baby? No. We missed something in the translation here. Obviously, it wasn't just because he was a real pretty baby. I mean, every one of us, every one of my boys, I'm like, oh, this boy's beautiful. I never looked at any of my babies and said, that one's okay. They're all beautiful. They're all beautiful, right? So we lose something in the translation here. What the words are teaching us is that when Moses was born, his parents, because of their faith in God, they weren't going to destroy their child. They're going to fear man more than they fear Pharaoh. They're not going to destroy their child. They looked at their child and said, this is a child of God. This is one of God's children. He is favored. He is chosen. This is our child. And by faith, we are going to love this child and do everything we can to keep this child alive, of course. And so what they did was incredible. They put they put baby Moses in a little basket. Noah comes to mind to me when I think about the basket that they put Moses in, because the word for ark is the same word for the basket that they put Moses in when they put him in the Nile. And it's the only 2 times it's used in the entire Bible. So they put Moses in this little miniature ark, right? And it says this. It says that his mom, after hiding him for 3 months, they're sneaking around, nursing their child, wanting to keep Moses alive, but they realize time is up. They have to do something. They ran out of options. It says that his mom took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. So can you imagine the agony that Moses' parents were going through? They ran out of time. They can't hide this child anymore. They're just trusting God, though. They make this miniature ark, and they place Moses in it. They put him in the Nile, but they put him in a Nile with a chance to live. They were just trusting their child to God in the most extreme way, right? And again, I think we have a little miniature lesson here for us parents. We need to trust our kids to God. I know that as my kids are getting into, are close to or in their teenage years already, I get nervous as a parent. What's their adult life going to look like? We need to trust our kids to the Lord and, raise them to know Him and then trust God. But ultimately, there's all kinds of sermons that could spin off from this lesson. But ultimately, they were trusting the Lord. Hey, this is one of His children. We're going to give him a chance to live, and we're going to trust him to God. And Moses comes right back to his parents like a boomerang. Here's how it happens. When you read the story, and again, I'm summarizing a lot of this, they put Moses in this miniature ark. He floats down the river, and there, Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in the Nile. And she notices this basket. She goes over to the basket, and they see that a baby is in there. And she took pity on the baby. And when she picked up the baby, she named him Moses because the name Moses means I drew him out of the water. So Pharaoh's daughter takes pity on this baby Hebrew slave, decides to raise it as her own, but she wants to hire a Hebrew to nurse the child. So she sends to have a Hebrew slave nurse the child, and she picks Moses' mother. So Moses comes back through a series of miraculous events, right? Miraculous circumstances. Moses is back in the arms of his mother, and she gets to raise her baby, but now her baby is Pharaoh's daughter's son. He is the grandson to the most powerful person on the planet Earth at that time. And so just an incredible series of events. We see Moses born in slavery, and then now he's Egyptian royalty. And so because of those miraculous circumstances, think of the upbringing of Moses. He's being raised with his parents, and some scholars, we don't know, we're not told how long he was able to be raised with his Hebrew parents, but some say it could have been like up to 12 years old that he was raised by his family. So he's raised to know who God is. He was raised to understand Hebrew culture and who the Israelites were. And then, but at the same time, he was then raised by Pharaoh's daughter in the most extravagant lifestyle possible on the planet Earth. Again, we can't exaggerate the extreme wealth that this Egyptian royalty lived in. And so he was given the best education. He lived in the most prestige of circumstances, wealth and accommodations. Any and everything this world had to offer, he had the best of it because he was the grandson of the most powerful man on the planet. But Moses, God had a different plan for his life. He was one of God's children, therefore he is to live by faith. And so what does living by faith look like in the life of Moses? Well, let's continue here in verses 24 and 25 so we can learn more about faith. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So by faith, living by faith, again, it means faith is fueled by the promises of God. He was looking forward to the reward of God. That's the big lesson about faith. When you want to live by faith, we learn over and over again in chapter 11, it's about looking forward and building your life on the promises of God and trusting in God that He will fulfill His promises. It's always looking down the road to our eternal inheritance. And so we learn this over and over, person to person. And Hebrews is teaching us this is what has always fueled faith in the lives of God's people. It's the promises of God. And so Moses, when he grew up with this incredibly unique situation of being caught in between these two worlds of the Hebrew slaves and the Egyptian royalty, he decided that a life with God, a life of faith that lived for God, meant refusing his Egyptian royalty. And so the turning point in the life of Moses, when we read in the book of Exodus, is very clear. He comes to this crossroads when he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And again, in some sense, he is Egyptian. In some sense, he is Hebrew. But when he sees this happening, it's a turning point. When this Egyptian is beating this Hebrew slave, Moses steps in and he kills the Egyptian. That's the moment that was the turning point for Moses. He kills the Egyptian and buries this body in the sand, hiding this Egyptian body and protecting this Hebrew slave. But at that point, he just made a choice. And I mean, living by faith, it does come down to making a choice, right? We don't want to underemphasize the fact that we have this responsibility to make a choice to live by faith. And that's what Moses did in that moment. I'm going to live for God. This sent him down a path. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Whenever we advertise our Christian faith, sometimes we see a lot of false advertisement, right? When we think of living by faith and being a child of God, we oftentimes over-romanticize the Christian life. Or in our best efforts to share our faith, we sometimes come across like, hey, come on, join the Christian community where everything is better and where life is more enjoyable. And you can live this victorious life, right? We almost overemphasize it sometimes to the point in which we promise this prosperity now, but that's not the life of faith, right? The life of faith is always looking forward. We want to invite people into a community of faith that has hope and promises. I think Moses' life here in those verses, he's a better advertisement for our faith. Moses is a truer advertisement when it says he chose to be mistreated with the people of God, over and above enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. That's what living with faith looks like. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Isn't that interesting that it says Moses considered the reproach of Christ greater? Did he know who Christ was? Well, this is being used as a reference, like the way of Christ, because obviously Christ is the ultimate example of someone who gave up royalty to condescend and to come to earth and to enter his creation and save his people, right? It's being used as a reference here to Christ because Moses is like one of the ultimate foreshadows of the coming Messiah. Remember what Paul says about Christ in 2 Corinthians 8:9. He says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." And of course, on a smaller scale, Moses did the same thing because he considered this way of life, this reproach of Christ, as more valuable than the fleeting pleasures of sin in this world. He left his position of royalty. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter so that he could go and embrace this reproach of Christ. His peers are going to disapprove. This is not going to go well for him in the Egyptian realm, but he considered it more valuable to live by faith. He considered it more valuable to serve God and his people, and that's what faith looks like. Consider the people of God, the community of God, and living for His purposes as more valuable than anything that this world has to offer. And of course, we are like Christ ultimately when we do that, because He condescended to come save us. Well, let's keep learning here about what faith is through the life of Moses in verses 27 through 28. It says, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So living by faith, and we've learned this lesson already as well through the life of Noah, but living by faith means fearing God more than fearing man. I bet you Pharaoh was super scary. I mean, life is cheap now, but life was super cheap back then to the world, right? I mean, this dude had absolute supreme power, but Moses, by faith, that is what empowered him. By faith, he endured in the face of that fear. I mean, he chose to fear God more than fear the most powerful person on the planet. When you see Jesus teaching in the New Testament, he of course teaches this very point. He says, fear him who after he is killed has the authority to cast you into hell. He's like, man, you can fear man on the planet Earth and that's fine. You can fear man, but fear God who can kill man and be the judge to determine if he's going to heaven or hell. Fear God over and above man. And so when we live by faith, that is what allows, it's not that we're not scared anymore. It's not that we don't fear things in this world anymore. It means that we have the courage, though, by faith, to face those fears. Faith is what empowers us to be courageous in the face of earthly fear. And this is what enabled Moses to be able to go and stand before Pharaoh and demand that he let his people go. And again, this is a quick synopsis of the life of Moses. But when you look back at the different situations Moses found himself in during the release of the Hebrew slaves and going through those 10 plagues, wow. Super inconvenient time of life for Moses. I mean, I went back and just kind of scanned through these Old Testament plagues to refresh my memory, right? We got the water that's turned, the Nile that's turned into blood. We got the plague of frogs. Then we had the plague of gnats. Oh man, I can't stand gnats. That would have been bad. Super. The fourth plague was flies. Like, I don't know what I hate worse, gnats or flies. It seems like flies are really bad this year for whatever reason. But man, gnats and flies ruined my day. Super inconvenient when the Egyptian livestock was killed off in a plague. There was boils, the plague of boils, a plague of hail, a plague of locusts, a plague of darkness, and then a plague of the death of the firstborn. And as Moses goes and warns Pharaoh and demands that Pharaoh let his people go, the kicker in every one of these plagues, the kicker is that God tells Moses up front, hey, when you go demand to let the Hebrew slaves go and warn of these plagues, every time you do that, Pharaoh is gonna not listen to you. And you know why he's not going to listen to you? He's going to not listen to you because I'm going to harden his heart. So he's going to refuse to let my people go because I'm going to harden his heart. It says that over and over in the book of Exodus. When you read about these plagues, when you read about this interaction between Moses living out his faith and Pharaoh, as he tells Moses, he's not going to listen to you. He's not going to let the people go because I'm going to harden his heart. And the reason for that is I'm going to multiply these plagues and make them great. I'm going to make myself known in the midst of this. I think this teaches us a tremendous amount about faith because, again, we tend to over-romanticize a life of faith. We tend to make it sound like, skipping through the field and rainbows and a great time all the time, but sometimes a life of faith, all the time, a life of faith needs to be submissive to God's sovereign timing. And his sovereign timing is often very inconvenient to us. It's often very uncomfortable to us. It's often situations we don't enjoy. I mean, I've heard so many times people say, well, if God's allowing this, I wouldn't do it that way. Or certain circumstances play out and they're like, man, I can't believe God dropped the ball on that one and let that unfold like that. What's the deal? I've even found myself, if I'm being really honest, several times where I'm just like, man, I feel like, God, why don't you just do this? This seems really easy right now. Why don't you just do this? You can do anything. It's pretty pretentious of us when we get in that posture, isn't it? I mean, us and our limited knowledge, and as we live out our faith, I think it's safe to say that the creator of the universe knows a little better than I do. I think it's safe to say that the creator of the universe, the sovereign God of all things that sustains everything, everywhere, all the time, I'm pretty sure if he's allowing something to happen, if he's allowing us to go through something, or if he does something special in this world like taking God's people through 10 plagues, he's got a purpose for it. Living by faith means trusting and obeying even when we don't fully understand. It means trusting and obeying even when it's not convenient or not what you want or not what you think is best. When you want to live out in faith, live out a life of faith, you endure through these times. I imagine Moses was not having a good time. I just imagine he was having a really bad time when he's going through those 10 plagues, right? It wasn't convenient, but you know, again, when you see the life of Moses and then you think about the life of Christ, our ultimate example, you see this play out in the life of Christ as well. As he lived out his life, was it convenient all the time? Well, obviously not when he's sweating, drops of blood in the garden, praying to God that he would take the cup from him. Don't let me go through this. I pray that I wouldn't have to go through this, God. He says, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus trusted in a greater purpose. He trusted his life to the Father. And so a life of faith, again, this is what we're learning about faith. What does faith look like? What does faith feel like? Well, don't make the mistake of thinking that a life of faith always feels good. Sometimes it feels like this. A life of faith sometimes is not understanding why God's doing something, but choosing to trust God anyway. It's a life of faith is sometimes going through a circumstance that you don't want to happen that way, but we have limited knowledge. We are limited beings, but we trust in one who is unlimited. We trust in one who is infinite. And so Moses trusted and obeyed even when he was having really bad days. I went and read especially the 10th plague. I went and read about the 10th plague because that's the plague that's referenced in Hebrews. And what we see in the 10th plague, when Moses is warning Pharaoh about the 10th plague, Pharaoh doesn't listen. He warns the Egyptians about the death of the firstborn. And after that experience of warning the Egyptians and telling everybody what was going to happen, it tells us the exact emotion that Moses was feeling in that moment. It says in Exodus chapter 11, verse 8, that Moses was hot with anger. But it doesn't tell us specifically why. Was he mad at Pharaoh? Was he mad at God? Was he mad at just the whole circumstance? It says that he was hot with anger. Here's this man living out his faith, being obedient, trusting God, and he's experiencing this emotion of hot anger, the worst type of anger. He's stomping his feet mad. Well, sometimes living out a life of faith experiences this. He was just mad about the whole situation, but despite that frustration, you trust and you obey. That's what faith does. Even when life is troublesome, it's trusting and it's obeying. So he relayed what God gave as instructions for this 10th plague. When we remember the instructions to get through this 10th plague, right? They were to slaughter a lamb because the plague was going to be a death of the firstborn. And he says, if you want to endure through this 10th plague, you're going to take a lamb without blemish, you're going to slaughter it. You're going to consume it with your entire household. Make sure that nothing is left. You're going to take the blood of this lamb and you're going to mark your doorposts with blood. And then you're going to pack your bags and you're going to be ready to go. And that judgment is going to pass over you. And Pharaoh is going to drive you out of Egypt, and you're going to be set free. And by faith, all these things happened, right? We see the story of Moses. By faith, they obeyed. They believed in what they could not see, and God followed through, and they were delivered. So this is perhaps, there's perhaps no greater foreshadow of the gospel of Jesus Christ than the Passover moment, right? And this is why this language is used to describe who Jesus is when he comes on the scene in the New Testament. When John the Baptist is preaching his message of repentance and he sees Jesus, what does he say? He says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And by faith, this gospel message we consume every week. By faith, we remember the blood shed on the cross that appeases the wrath of God. By faith, we believe that this judgment of God, because of this death on the cross, will pass over us. And by faith, we are set free. We are redeemed by our Creator through the death of His Son on the cross. This is the gospel message that gives us life and that gives us hope and that points us forward to an eternal reward, an eternal inheritance. That is the hope that we are to live by in this world. And so now, just like the Israelites, here we are, wandering in this world like exiles. We're sojourners. This is not the ultimate destination, but that future destination with God, free from sin, seeing Him and knowing Him face to face. It is as good as ours now by faith. This is the faith we preach. This is the faith we live by. And this is the faith that we are to share. It doesn't always feel good, but it is salvation. And we're thankful for these examples so that we don't get the wrong idea of faith and so that we don't put hope in ourselves and our current circumstances, but rather in the one who sustains and saves us, our Creator. All right, let's pray.